In 2014, respected academics Martin Gilens of Princeton University and Benjamin Page of Northwestern published a major study on policy outcomes in the world's most renowned democracy and the largest economy in history, the United States of America. The results? The US, once a shining beacon of free enterprise and the right of all people to have a say in their future, was no longer a democratic society. But what has caused this fundamental and existential shift? Well, many commentators argue that electoral funding laws in the US are outdated, providing the opportunity for wealthy elites to have an unfair impact on political outcomes, while others have argued that the cost of running an election campaign has gotten so high, only established political parties can even afford to run. And while there is no doubt validity to these arguments, we believe there is more to it. The digital revolution has fundamentally changed the ways people interact with one another. In an article for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, Daniel Shapiro, along with several other authors, noted that tribalism has washed across countries and cultures with the tides of globalization. Brady Robards recently argued that social media sites such as Reddit encourage users to form neo-tribes, with many of the site's subreddits operating in a very specific shared set of language conventions, rules, expectations, and rituals. But haven't people in societies always been tribal? Why does this new form of digital tribalism mean something different for the future of democracy? Well, it is our belief that this new age of digital tribalism has significant implications for both governments and companies. Join us as we look to explore the rise of corporate sovereignty and understand how the future is being shaped by the new hegemons of the 21st century. Throughout history, merchants, wealthy benefactors and corporations have always influenced state policy, from rich lords bankrolling medieval wars to super PACs in the modern world. And as discussed in our Dread Pirates and Dead Bankers episode, it's incredibly important for empires to have flourishing economic conditions, which empower governments to deliver social outcomes. Similarly, a strong economy is incredibly important for governments to build and maintain a strong military, which historically has been incredibly important for successful states to function. So it's not surprising that financial interests often influence government decision making. However, across most successful empires, there's always been a fine balance between the state and merchants or companies. On one side, the wealth of a nation provides taxable income, while on the other side, the state provides safe supply lines and cities in which merchants can operate. And this naturally creates a series of checks and balances which help reduce the power of any one actor in an economy. If the head of a state becomes too powerful, they will be held accountable by the financial centers, while merchants that become too powerful are held to account by the military and the social remit of the state. But in the 21st century, this is starting to change. In the last episode, we spoke about how new digitized currencies are empowering consumers to move away from relying on governments and banks to facilitate the exchange of goods. And this means that governments have a declining ability to control economic and social activities without the use of force. And to some, the implications of reducing the intrinsic control currencies have over consumer trade and moving more towards a free market might seem like a good thing, but it does have some pretty substantial implications. Let's talk about anarchy. Essentially, an anarchist state occurs when there is no clearly defined government. Each person is left to represent themselves at a social and economic level. Regulations are not dictated by a central body, but instead people are encouraged to work towards mutually beneficial outcomes. In an anarchist state, a merchant or company might hire a security firm to ensure people don't steal from their shop. Now, there is no government system to enforce the contract, so if the security firm decide not to actually provide security, they cannot be sued or arrested for breach of contract. So what is the motivation for the security firm to fulfill the contract to the best of their ability? Well, it's because they receive an agreed remuneration, that is, they get paid, and at the same time, if they don't fulfill the contract to the best of their ability, their reputation could be hurt when the merchant tells all of their friends not to work with that security firm. It's about long-term sustainability. It's important to note, anarchistic systems are not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, many Western societies today arguably use a range of anarchistic tools to help economies work more effectively. For example, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms such as mediation and conciliation are highly effective ways of resolving conflict outside of the congested governmental court systems. So why don't we remove government altogether and live in glorious anarchy? Well, it comes down to human nature. Humans are inclined towards group behaviour. For many years, social scientists from Geert Hofstede to Germaine Greer have observed the incredible ways that humans create value structures and cultural norms. In 2011, Jonathan Haidt argued there is mounting evidence human reasoning was designed in large part to do social stuff. And this manifests in very interesting ways. As a species, we are highly tribal, and this concept comes up in a number of philosophical paradigms, all the way from the Savannah principle through to functionalism theory. It appears that early in our evolution, humans discovered that working together in groups was a highly effective way at achieving good social outcomes. And this concept also holds true with economic theories such as gaming theory, which demonstrate that outcomes which benefit the majority of people in a group are generally the best outcome for the individual as well. The problem with tribalism is that it often manifests in quite insular ways. People who don't belong to the group are considered outsiders, while core members of the group can become almost holy in nature. Just look at how hardline conservatives in the US revere Reagan. The second major difficulty, as Jonathan Haidt states, is that humans are very good at finding evidence to justify their views, actions, and the position of the groups they are members of. But when it comes to seeking out evidence for conflicting views, few of us can get past our confirmation bias. Coupled with humanity's inherent territorial nature, this can manifest as quite a problem. As humans, we have brought this animalistic urge to many modern problems. Often the most basic of debates or conflicts evoke highly aggressive responses. A perfect example of this is road rage, or during Black Friday shopping sales. So why do we bring it up? Well, humans who are highly territorial have discovered that when we work in groups, we are more easily able to prosecute our territorial instincts. If you can find 10 people that believe in the same things you do, then why not come together and solve the problem? This is how sovereignty first came into being. People living in a similar geographical area decided to work together so they could stop outsiders from invading their land. But how do we ensure our groups stay together and don't shift towards what is best for any individual at any given moment? Well, humans are highly prone to religious thinking. We identify a series of problems that affect multiple people and create norms and value structures to ideologically keep the group together. For example, in the US, the flag has been elevated to an almost religiously unifying symbol. So bringing it back to our potential glorious anarchistic state, here is why they rarely work. People naturally bind together into groups to increase their influence and power in comparison to others in society. So, despite currencies around the world becoming decentralized from governments and banks, And despite technologies such as online shopping and 3D printers making it much harder for traditional governments to control supply chains in their country, it is our belief that humans have no intention of doing away with government. Instead, we believe that corporate states will emerge in the 21st century, once again binding people together across the Western world. But this time, it won't be based on where a person lives, but on what they consume. So what does this mean for governments in a world with increasingly porous supply and demand chains? Well, if we look back at the third industrial revolution, which took place in the second half of the 20th century, we have a pretty good case study. Globalization has had a substantial impact on both supply and demand by breaking down trade barriers, which led to increasing access to global markets. Perhaps most pertinently, globalization has led to the rise of multinational or transnational corporations. Now, having companies that operate across national borders is not new, and much like anarchist systems, are not inherently a bad thing. However, there have been a number of implications for Western governments. Most obvious of these is the impact on taxable revenue. And take the world's most valuable company, for example. According to a 2017 report from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, Apple earned $305 billion before tax between 2008 and 2015. And during that time, the company paid a foreign tax rate of just 5.8% instead of the US corporate tax rate of 35%. Despite their headquarters operating out of California, Apple has structured their company to be officially located in Ireland, though through some creative accounting, much of the company appears to be located in neither the US or Ireland, meaning a huge amount of their revenue wasn't taxed at all. Now, it's important for us to note it's unlikely that anything Apple have done is actually illegal, and that's the problem. This type of behaviour is not unusual. Storing profits offshore and avoiding tax has been a fairly common practice for many years now. Globalization has simply amplified the trend. Beyond this, governments are less likely to physically stop the flow of goods from large transnational corporations who don't necessarily pay their taxes ethically because of a fear of consumer backlash. Okay, so you might be asking, what do anarchist governments, tribalism, and globalization have to do with democracy? Well, in our opinion, quite a bit. In the 21st century, as citizens increasingly migrate their buying behaviour online, it is quite reasonable to expect government control over supply and their ability to collect reliable taxable revenue will only be further eroded. Overlay that with the decentralisation of currency, and you have a scenario where the market control options available to governments start to disappear. Remember, you can't simply send a police force to stop a company operating out of another country. Try that and you're likely going to start World War III. Overlay this with the rise of automated manufacturing devices such as 3D printers, where consumers no longer need to actually buy most physical products, and governments will be unable to intercept or disrupt anything but the largest of physical purchases, such as property and raw materials. So, how will this affect democracy? Well, in a system where the government cannot use their centralised power to control market conditions, you arrive in a state of anarchy. The system relies on market conditions and behavioural economics to dictate behaviours and protect consumers. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The world's largest economy, the US, was founded on free market principles, encouraging consumer choice in a competitive marketplace, ensuring citizens were treated fairly, and innovation was a cornerstone principle of all companies. However, the problem we're now encountering comes back to our tribalism. As we become familiar with companies and brands, we typically gravitate towards them. This is particularly the case where a brand becomes synonymous with a person's social alignment. Let's return to our Apple example. Apple commands a legion of highly loyal and highly vocal fans who associate their social identity with the company, not because of their products, but because of their brand, which is progressive and design focused. Now look at Apple's main competitor, Microsoft. By and large, Mac users are not only hesitant to use a Microsoft computer, but they will actively advocate against using a PC because the products themselves are not associated with Apple's brand identity. So what does this mean for a digital 21st century marketplace? Well, we're not sure, but we can hypothesize a little bit. As geographical borders continue to break down, government regulators are less likely to be able to ensure service providers operate at minimum quality standards. As a result, consumers will need to be more active in holding corporations to account themselves. And this is already being seen to an extent, with consumers now relying heavily on the opinions of other people. For example, in 2017, TripAdvisor reached more than 500 million reviews and opinions for travel services across the globe, with up to 200 new contributions made every minute. And a recent survey found up to 4 in 5 consumers usually or always read an average of 6 to 7 reviews before actually visiting a place. While on the surface, this may seem like a great outcome for consumers, there are some potential risks that could really affect societies. Foremost of these is the centralization of information gathering services. For example, Facebook have bought more than 50 separate companies since 2005, including Instagram and WhatsApp. Similarly, Alphabet Incorporated own Google, YouTube, and Pinterest. And this now means a small number of mega corporations, including Apple, Disney, and News Corp, control the main information channels in Western societies, giving them unprecedented influence. Now let's be clear, media channels do exist outside of these mega corporations, but they are increasingly reliant on social media platforms such as Twitter to get their message to consumers. Let's look at the recent example of InfoWars and Alex Jones. Regardless of your opinion of Jones, he's a phenomenally popular figure who has managed to cultivate a massive audience outside of the mainstream media. Recently, Google, Facebook, and Apple made a joint decision to ban him from their platforms. Now, they are private companies and have absolutely every right to do this, particularly in the more anarchistic marketplace that is the internet. The result? Jones is now in quite a serious place. The move will have a major impact on his ability to reach his fans. Now you may ask, why is this a problem? Wasn't Alex Jones delusional? Haven't these companies done the right thing by removing someone they felt was immoral and potentially dangerous? And the truth is, it depends. The problem is, these companies arguably now have more control than the democratically elected governments operating in many Western countries. Think about the impact that News Corp has over election cycles in Western countries like the US, Australia, or England. Or look at Apple. It's now worth over $1 trillion, meaning it makes up almost 1% of the world's total GDP. It's bigger than the entire Singaporean stock exchange. And the company is still growing, meaning their power is only going to increase. Now, Western governments do still have control, but think about how much more amplified the power of these companies will become as consumer behavior continues to migrate online, as currency decentralizes, and as global markets become even more porous. These mega actors will continue buying up market share, and we will continue to align ourselves with them as consumers, because that's what we are, religious and tribal creatures. Through this power, these companies have become the new hegemons of the digital age. But back to the question, isn't the censoring of someone like Alex Jones a good thing? Well, that's not really the point. When studying international relations, there is a theoretical framework known as the hegemonic stability theory. The theory states that as a singular dominant economic power arises in the world, global stability initially increases and people are arguably better off. The rise of the US after the fall of the USSR is a perfect example. Globally, standards of living and civil stability has increased dramatically throughout that period. The problem is that throughout history, benevolent hegemons have almost always become predatory over time. Even the most beloved of rulers become tyrants if they are not kept in check. Even though stopping Alex Jones is an arguably ethical move, what reason do we have to expect them to do the right thing next time? Without proper checks and balances in place, how can we expect companies to act in the common interest rather than for the benefit of all their shareholders? So how will democratic societies overcome the influence of these new mega actors who have the ability to decide what each of us will and won't see and hear? My feeling is that governments will begin setting up alliances with globally digitized corporations in lieu of direct regulations to control the market. For example, the US government may create a permanent alliance with Google, allowing the company to exist and operate freely without paying tax in return for proactive behaviours such as ensuring American-made products always appear at the top of their search findings. As long as these corporate partners and the government continue to honour the partnership, it will stand strong. And these types of partnerships are not a new concept. As we've stated earlier, monarchs in Europe relied on strategic partnerships with economically powerful lords and barons for centuries to maintain the support of the people. So, by no means do we expect democracy to end, but it will fundamentally change. And that means we, as the people, need to be more militant than ever. In the near future, you will no longer just be a citizen of your country of birth, you will be a mercenary, living under the brands and companies that control your newsfeed, and by extension, the world. And it will be up to each of us to hold our new hegemons to account. Join us next week as we discuss the Consumerocracy, a new governmental system we believe will rise from the ashes of the great fallen empire.